I wanted to just say a few words before we begin the reading of this paper, which I believe is going to take 2 sessions. Maybe it'll be done in one, but it's about 20,000 words and it's dense. The thing about this paper, the reason why I wanted to read it in the sequence that we're reading it now, having first read Billington's paper on East and West and the mutual co-development of philosophies from Platonic and Confucian worlds, as well as the political and geopolitical ramifications of those two systems. All the way to the next thing that we read was what it was, In Defense of Common Sense, sort of an introduction to the science of physical economy, but more importantly, the science, the real battle for a physical science which is in harmony with the creative geometry of the mind, of a healthy mind, which is in harmony with the creative nature of the universe. That one has to exude an inner quality to have an inner standard to direct oneself in recognizing an outer truth, right? Otherwise, what are you relating it to? So we had a fun 12 chapters going through different mental exercises that LaRouche laid out in that small book on physical versus purely mathematical approaches to thinking, and their physical applications in terms of making the world better for human beings. Then we read Max Planck and Planck's famous essay, his Philosophy of Physics, which was just just a gorgeous exposition of a healthy, potent philosophy of science that bears fruit, because Planck wasn't just another philosopher. He was somebody who really did make discoveries into universal constants, and he was in a position to know what his mind was doing when he talked about what is the philosophy of a healthy human mind. So why read people who never made discoveries to hear their thoughts about philosophy when you could just read the writings of people who actually made discoveries, right? And see what they have to say. Much better. So there was anybody who's read Leibniz, who's read Plato, who's read LaRouche, got a sense from Planck that it was all there. The entire mode of composing your thoughts was very much something you recognize, which is why now, before we go on to read some actual writings by Leibniz, which we'll be doing soon, I wanted this thing to be the next thing we look at. And this was a research paper done in 2013. I published it immediately at the time on the Canadian Patriot website. And as far as I know, I think it was the only website to do that. Nobody else really bothered publishing this wonderful study conducted by Michael Kirsch, an old friend of mine. I haven't talked to him in a long time, but I was really happy that he did this work. And Michael Kirsch is somebody who had really done the work more than most people to rediscover the calculus, a lot of the core discoveries, and he taught classes on Gauss and on Riemann. He did a lot of wonderful constructive geometry. So he wasn't, as well as being a historian, he really distinguished himself. Even today, he's written an authoritative book a couple of years ago on American system economics from Cotton Mather to the present. And he really distinguished himself on a number of fields of research and was able to synthesize them in a really nice way. So in this paper that he does, it's called Venice versus Leibniz, a battle for the science of physical economy. And there has been, as we will see, one of the driving causal thrusts of world history has been over the unification of science, all the sciences, the various branches, including the practical applied sciences in terms of sociology, economics, along with the arts. So the breaking of the wall separating the arts and the hard sciences. And the more that we find that there have been movements, whether it's Plato's Academy in ancient times, which featured pioneering work and discoveries in geometry and astronomy, as well as aesthetics in architecture and in the golden section, as well as philosophy, as well as geopolitics, as we've discovered with Xenophon, who Cynthia is going to go through in her class on Sunday, and a lot more. There was real practical political ramifications for these ideas, but they were being unified. At the same time that this happens in history, and we have multiple examples of this, we also have a counter movement by the oligarchs who tend to want to rule by division, by dividing to conquer. And so there's an opposing way of thinking that's being promoted by forces of empire who wish to separate and sever the human mind from itself in as many ways as possible. One of the more effective ways after the Renaissance made it clear with people like Da Vinci, Machiavelli, and others, when the Renaissance was making it clear that the human mind was a unity, that we were made in the image of a creator, and that idea was more than simply a hypothesis, but it was provable. And we were making incredible dense discoveries in so many fields all at once, right? And you can see the population growth curves of the last 600 years. We could just see after the Middle Ages, when you had that Renaissance period, an associated spike in human population. That population growth isn't a sign that we were a cancer, but rather it was a sign that we were doing something right, that we could sustain more people at a higher quality of life by a certain way of thinking. So the fruits of medicine, of astronomy, of canal building, hygiene, other things, all arose with the Renaissance, as well as many other things. So the oligarchy realized that they couldn't any longer just keep the world, the mind of people divided, but they had to use a form of sophistry to say, let's unite. We also want to unite the mind into a oneness. But it was promoted in such a way that if you adopted their view of oneness, you couldn't actually use your mind properly. And this became a Venetian technique that was honed and honed and honed to the point that I was just doing work today. I had an interview on the origins of the Fourth Industrial Revolution promoted by Klaus Schwab. And obviously the idea of automation isn't a bad thing, but the idea isn't just automation. It's that AI, automation, new forms of even genetic engineering, all of these things are going to create a new cycle in human evolution that will involve creating a completely new, gigantic, useless class of people who will be replaced by machines. That machine learning is going to replace the human mind, unless we follow Elon Musk's call for uniting and merging with machines to make ourselves relevant. But we had a discussion about where does all this come from, because it's bunk. It's not scientific. It's really like an oligarch's fantasy dream, but it's not real. And where does this all come from? So we had a discussion on Norbert Wiener and the rise of cybernetics during and after World War II, which is when this really got off the ground. And in this book by Norbert Wiener, he's calling essentially, and these are being sponsored by things like the Macy Foundation, which was a big eugenics sponsoring foundation with the Rockefeller Foundation throughout the 30s and 40s. So they're the ones who sponsored all of these Macy Foundation conferences on cybernetics. And in his book, I was struck by the fact that he says, at this point there enters, and this is a quote by Norbert Wiener, the founder of this whole idea of machine learning, self-reproducing machines, yada, yada. He says, at this point, there enters an element which occurs repeatedly in the history of cybernetics, the influence of mathematical logic. If I were to choose a patron saint for cybernetics out of the history of science, I should have to choose Leibniz. The philosophy of Leibniz centers about two closely related concepts, that of a universal symbolism and that of a calculus of reasoning. From these are descended the mathematical notation and the symbolic logic for the present day. Indeed, Leibniz himself, like his predecessor Pascal, was interested in the construction of computing machines in metal. It is therefore not in the least surprising that the same intellectual impulse which has led to the development of mathematical logic has at the same time led to the ideal or actual mechanization of processes of thought. Now, this is interesting for two reasons. And then in the next page, he talks about how he loved Russell and studied. He says, I am a former student of Bertrand Russell and owe everything to his influence. And he goes on talking about Turing machines, things like that. Now, this is interesting because he's a liar on the one hand, because he says he loves Leibniz. And yet he's saying that if Leibniz were alive today, that Leibniz should be the patron saint of cybernetics. But he's saying that cybernetics is essentially the new science that will involve increasingly machine learning that will eventually replace human thought. And cybernetics is really just something that goes on to become a tool for social engineering, because in the term cybernetics, it literally means it's rooted in an idea of the helmsman, that nobody in the boat, goes back to ancient Greece, and the idea is, all of the people rowing the boat, they don't need to know navigation or the knowledge of the mechanics of the boat. You just need one person to know that. Everyone else is compartmentalized to do their local duty. And so you can control a complex system if you keep it divided and compartmentalized in such a way that only a few managing the nervous system, which is, they're always relating everything to a nervous system, that there's like only one zone controlling all the parts of the body. And the body is what they're always thinking of as the body of government, the body of education, the body of different departments. So this is something that goes on to become wired into NATO. It becomes wired in with systems analysis that Wiener and John von Neumann also create. This becomes the language of the social engineers that becomes embedded in the OECD reforms of education. It becomes embedded in the World Health Organization under G. Brock Christholm, as well as, and again, UNESCO under Julian Huxley. So the idea is, and in all of these Macy conferences, they're always bringing in experts from different fields. They're really wanting to unite and create a new unified field of all sciences, including especially psychiatry. And that's why John Rawlings Rees, who works very closely with Wiener and Brock Christholm, Rees becomes the founder of the World Federation of Mental Health. He's also the head of Tavistock, as is Christholm, who is the first Director General of the World Health Organization, who's also working formally in Tavistock. All of these guys are working together in these cybernetics conferences very closely, and they're all promoting a new global government, eugenics, and also transhumanism, the idea that Julian Huxley develops of creating a transhumanist movement where we take control of our own evolution through the mechanization and merging of man and machine. So again, they're really attacking Leibniz directly, and it becomes clear, as we will see, that this is a master key for world history. Understanding Leibniz, who really was a universal thinker of the highest order. He was a Platonic humanist of the highest order who did incredible discoveries into so many things, into so many fields that he integrated into himself. Part of his own genius he describes as being caused by or partook in his love of language. He spoke something like 14 different languages. He developed the first computing machines. And he also developed the science of physical economy, which is why we're going to see in this paper that the application of all of this fruitful mode of thinking into a science of human happiness is really key, which becomes advanced upon later on after Leibniz dies by Benjamin Franklin and the American System School that arose in the students of Ben Franklin, that was then championed in more recent years by Lyndon LaRouche. And so LaRouche's name will be coming up, and I want people to really just think about the science of physical economy that we looked at and a little bit more into future readings. Anyway, we can incorporate that later, but that's all I wanted to say for just intro. We're going to have links to all of these documents in the description box of this video. And next, when we finish this, we're going to then read some Leibniz. I think the discourses on metaphysics and maybe something on physical economy will be good. So for now, I will do a screen share. Where is it? I've got way too many windows open. Okay. Okay. Do people see the screen that says Canadian Patriot in front of them?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Great. So, yeah, we'll just take turns. I mean, I don't really, it's not broken up into pages. So please, we're probably going to stop and chat throughout this more than we have in previous papers. So just feel free to say, whoa, I don't get that, or can we just talk about this for a little bit more? Jerry, do you want to start off the reading?
Yes.
Okay.
I can do that, no problem.
And Eureka, are you good to read today, or do you want to follow on?
Yep.
Just follow.
I can read today.
Okay.
Okay, I'll start. Venice and Leibniz, the battle for a science of economy, by Michael Kirsch. If citizens knew that between Galileo Galilei, René Descartes, and Isaac Newton, not a single discovery was ever made, then the illusion that there is a basis for believing in Adam Smith's, quote, self-correction of the market, unquote, a self-evident value of money, the validity of statistical methods, and any necessity for London and Wall Street would instantly vanish. But if citizens further knew of the unique mind and fight, which was the life of Gottfried Leibniz, then the Venetian monetary system's long campaign against the Westphalian era of the nation state could be halted, as if at the coroner's door, in its present and impossible desire to rule over a much reduced world population, and human discovery would be unbound. So it happened that after the day Gottfried Leibniz died, a Venetian priest led Europe by the hand into bed with Isaac Newton, corrupting all of its future conceptions. Venice's fight to beat back the 15th century Renaissance is long, but only here do we find the clarity to make sense of modern civilization's struggle against a monetary system which is currently gutting the U.S. of its last vestiges of creativity in economics, and using its own agent as president for that goal, a clarity which has otherwise been intentionally obscured by that monetary system itself.
At the time, of course, the president was Obama, but unfortunately, nothing has changed in terms of how we read that. So,
all of this will be rendered transparent for you, the reader. And with the understanding gained here, there is no place for the enemies of our nation to hide. If citizens would merely point out facts unpleasant to their controllers and benefactors, attempting to drive civilization further along its present dark age plunge. Citizens of our republic, the authority by which you fight the consequences of today's death of the global monetary system lies in a tale which these pages tell of Leibniz's war with Venice, one which characterized the issue still and now determining the fight for civilization. And it is with this authority that the minds of our time can stand with confidence behind the actions which must be taken to advance mankind's present condition towards its proper place in the universe, through a realization of the inner meaning of science and discovery. Thus, let the veil be lifted, and the following dramatic tale unfolded, exposing the truth that the universe and your mind does not work the way the financial markets and the global monetary system would need it to work in order to continue their political power. Introduction. In the 11th and 12th century AD, Venice became the seat of an international monetary system, governing through usury, and creating debtors through the Crusades to gain trade dominance of the world. Venice continued to spread until its evil system of usurious lending, banking, and wars collapsed into the bloody Black Death of the 14th century. Civilized society arose from that bestial hell unleashed by Venice in the form of the 15th century movement of the sovereign nation state, and Venice's system became weaker and weaker. Sovereign nations acted outside of the remains of Venice's empire and made laws in accord with the well-being of their subjects, the expression of the principle of the common good. Man's realization of his own creative nature spread more rapidly than any operations Venice could run to break up the growing nation-state movement. And much to its woe, nations inevitably raised the standard of physical productivity and creativity. By the middle of the 16th century, factionalization diminished Venice's power further. It was in this way that in the closing decades of the 16th century, a faction emerged among leading Venetian families, a party called the Giovanni, the youthful, and the resolve to move Venice in a new direction forced the Venetian oligarchy of the time to cede power over to them. Out of the gatherings sponsored by the Giovanni circles, Paolo Sarpy came up with a new insight to save Venice and rose to become the intellectual leader of the party. It was clear to Venice early on, after the rise of this nation-state movement, that science had to be stopped altogether, because it was from this Renaissance view of man that its power flowed. But the basis for the success of Sarpy's political faction was Sarpy's realization that it was not enough to continue to run an anti-science campaign. Paolo Sarpy took a more energetic and insightful approach, disconnecting the mind from the universe. The conception of Renaissance founder Nicholas of Cusa, and that behind the nation-state, was that mankind can understand the reasoning process by which the actions of non-living, living, and cognitive physical objects in the universe are created. Use that discovered reasoning process as a way to truly understand the actions of those objects, and thus have insight into the reasoning behind the creation of the universe as a whole. This was the basis for the only competent science, and the fact that mankind can know universal principles, wield them to act in society, and use them to transform society as a whole, leading to a culture that follows the power of reason above all.
Okay, now one moment, because I know that some of these footnotes are very good and very dense, so I don't want to miss out on the good ones. So what I'll do is just open this in another window and have the footnotes open all the time, so it won't be too hard to switch. Here we are. All right. Okay, footnote 1 is not very big. It's just, this is the meaning of what is otherwise known as the Trinity in Christian theology. Okay, that doesn't say very much, but okay. And whenever we have footnotes in a paragraph, we'll wait till we get to the end of the paragraph, and then we'll read the footnotes as it.
Okay. All right. Sarpy's program was to destroy this view and promote one opposite to it, all in the name of science, severing the mind from its compatibility with the universe entirely. This was accomplished in 3 steps. First, Sarpy defined the nature of the universe and the nature of actions of bodies in the universe as reduced merely to the sensual depiction of the bodies themselves. That is, the fact that they can be described with length, depth, and breadth, and that they moved around in certain ways. Sarpy argued, quote, "The matter of natural things is nothing else than extended body understood, being what persists through transformation and never ceases to be. The body is indefinite extension, which, delimited by surface, line, and point, assumes a shape. It constitutes of itself an infinite and unordered continuum upon which infinite orderings and infinite figures may impress themselves. Universals have no existence whatsoever. What do exist are bodies, extended and shaped, which determine and cut into matter so as to make up individual objects, which man may perceive through external passive senses, and matched to one another, depending on how they resemble one another, thanks to an active and internal sense." That's footnote number 2.
And footnote 2 reads, "This is a summary of Sarpy's argument by University of Rome's Professor Vittorio Fregisi from Sarpy the Skeptic, State and Church in Venice between 1500 and 1600, published in 1994. All other quotes in this and the next section are direct quotes from Sarpy's The Art of Proper Thinking and Philosophical Thoughts."
Okay. There was nothing essential to any created thing that held it together which the mind could discover in either non-living, living, or cognitive species. No universals, no principles, and no laws unseen. They were asserted to be purely mental constructs to serve the fantasies of man, who hoped to be wise, but in reality would never be better than a beast. As Sarpy himself wrote cynically, quote, "Essence and universality are works of the mind," unquote. This limitation of human knowledge to matter as pure extension served to define the relation between the mind and the nature of actions of non-living, living, and cognitive physical objects in the universe to be one of purely sense perception. Since principles are non-existent, but renamed as merely the, quote, "arrangement of matter," unquote, having the property of extension, there is no qualitative difference between any existing thing. The entire universe is a linear, homogeneous soup. Principles of motion was considered only as, quote, "not but arrangement," unquote, and actually non-existent. With individual objects only, quote, "having existence for the benefit of its own matter," unquote, there are no actual reasons for anything to exist. The next step, to define how man related to that infinitely boring and extended universe, was then based on the man of Sarpy's nature. Since the universe of the unseen doesn't exist, the man of Sarpy's mind has no ideas, but only considers sensations. Therefore, Sarpy claimed that reason is non-existent. Quote, "We distinguish between our senses and our reason only in order to be able to disclaim responsibility for our acts," unquote. In this way, all connection between the sense perception observed by the mind back to the mind itself is removed, in effect, severing the senses from their own subjective origin in which the power of hypothesis lies. But if something can then be sensually described, then that description is called a law, whether or not that description leads to a reasonable explanation for the process. In other words, with no knowable laws of the universe, Sarpy came up with a new definition for law as merely the formalization of observed senses. They were not truths or principles that actually govern anything about nature by which a scientist could knowably unfold a process in his mind. They are not intrinsic to an unseen organization, but are only laws of descriptive effects. The scientist is relegated to using descriptive formulas of these so-called laws to mechanically extrapolate future events based upon constant repetition of events past. Third, and finally, since it is only these kinds of laws which mankind can hope for, in a universe which contains and consists of no universals whatsoever, Sarpy defined the creator of such a universe as powerful, but not necessarily reasonable, and the created and creation itself unknowable. Therefore, with the creator lending no assistance, Sarpy's whole theorem lattice comes full circle. Mankind could not hope to discover the reason for anything created nor how it works, and is left to the role of Vanna White. Okay, there was a footnote number 3 in there.
Yep. I just here. Okay, footnote 3 reads, in his Reflections on the Doctrine of the Universal Spirit, 1702, Gottfried Leibniz would later explicitly identify in detail that Sarpy's concept here was based on a revival of the Averroist Occamite philosophers Contarini and Pomponazzi.
In summary, by clearing out the possibility of the mind to understand unseen principles which govern the senses, Sarpy disconnected the mind from the universe, the real universe, since reality is not the reflection of flames on a wall, but the principles which cause the flames themselves to dance the way they do.
So that was a very rich opening segment. I guess we could rotate maybe every 15-20 minutes the speaker. So far was that okay, or does anybody have any thoughts or questions based on some of that? So it's a pretty clear formula, threefold step. Redefine the mind as being co-equal to the senses, then defined how the mind works as being simply looking for descriptive laws that you could extrapolate into the future by pattern formation. Bacon becomes a proponent of that later on. And then third, introduce the, I guess this is more implicit, that the thing which created the universe that you're investigating itself is ultimately also as unreasonable as you are. So pretty simple formula. Okay, Eureka or Kwan, who wants to pick it up?
I'll go.
Okay.
That
Can you speak a little bit more closely into the mic or into your device?
be a beast. And since there was nothing man could seek to discover for himself for posterity, Sarpy explained that future orientation, a key to mankind's commitment to the continuity of discovery, was merely an irrational waste of time, illogical and irrelevant to man's existence. The wise man, wrote Sarpy, simply lives in the present like an animal or baby boomer in Congress, and knows that there are no truths, only opinions, all of which are just as good as the other. Be degenerate, he says. Do not follow opinion that wears the title of truth, but rather opinion that wears the title of pleasure or usefulness. The wise man, writes Sarpy, recognizes that his efforts at obtaining knowledge always come up against the infinite, and, knowing this is beyond his grasp, he stops and comes to no final decision on any matter, deciding to live according to the day-to-day appearance of things and, in public, support those beliefs which are commonly held. And while concocting this philosophy as the basis for securing the future existence of Venice for that purpose, Sarpy's philosophy held that the future doesn't exist and one must take in present pleasures instead, as that is all that is within the grasp of mankind. The end of man, as of every other living creature, is to live, simply live in the here and now. Free oneself from projecting the imagination into the past or future, and enjoy the present time, not for anticipation of the future, but for itself. Like a beast, forget the past and future, trust not in the mind, live for the present means, enjoy the present pleasures, and let the ends work out for themselves. Footnote 4.
Oh, right. Yes. Uh-oh. Sorry. Footnote 4. In all of this, astute minds may feel the presence of Adam Smith in his Theory of Moral Sentiments, 1759.
Sarpy's children. This is the modern empiricist model. Define the sense objects, have them move, but no idea how or reason to find how the objects move, just descriptive laws of their motions, and consequently, information from the senses is considered self-evident truth, principles and causes non-existent, the universe irrational. The mind does not consider its own ability to detect the governing principles of physical processes that would give it a greater power. In truth, nothing could and ever was discovered by this method. In fact, it led to as many real discoveries as Galileo Galilei actually made. That is, in full truth, absolutely none.
Damn. He said it.
Sarpy succeeded in popularizing his own philosophical system by building up an archetype for his model consistent with Venetian usury through Galileo Galilei. For the sake of making Galileo a star, Sarpy and his networks plagiarized for him. The list is impressive. Da Vinci and Zacharias Janssen were the inventors of Galileo's telescope. Giovanni Francesco Sagredo, the true inventor of Galileo's thermometer, Santorio and Filippo Salviati, the real producers of Galileo's weight and mechanics. Johann Kepler and Simon Marius, the true discoverers of Galileo's moon of Jupiter and new star, Baldassare Capra, the true inventor of Galileo's geometer's compass, and Christopher Scheiner, the true discoverer of Galileo's sunspots. All of this was fed to Galileo, who was to take on the image of a real scientist in order to explicitly destroy both Pusa's Renaissance view of man and the contemporary genius of Kepler. Footnote 5.
Uh, I guess, yeah, in this case, I'll read it now. All right, 1 second. Footnote 5 reads, to simply underscore the fact that Sarpy and his servant Galileo were witting frauds, it is noted here that while Galileo was whoring for his reputation, Kepler showed the true causes of the motions of heavenly bodies, and in so doing, he connected an understanding of an unseen principle with its effects, in such a way as to be able to forecast the future state of planets, as an expression of that cause, and simultaneously experimentally demonstrated the universe to be made knowable through a method of looking for paradoxes in the sensory data which reveal the cause. In fact, Sarpy's leading enemy during his lifetime was Kepler, and Galileo was used as much as possible to deter him, claim Kepler's fame for himself, and even attempt to kill him, as expressed in Galileo's death threat in 1624, declaring Kepler to be a heretic. That's something worth following up on.
Galileo would convey the plagiarisms as his through the tongue of Sarpy's philosophy, as though it was this new method of thinking of Sarpy that was responsible for the discoveries. Any resistance to Galileo's sponsored dictatorship over science was met with the full weight of Sarpy's political networks. Footnote 6.
And just so anybody listening who wants to look a little bit more into this, they should Google and try to find conversations with the starry messenger, the letters between Kepler and Galileo, which are really good. And Kepler is always trying to encourage Galileo to actually come out openly and publicly with the view that the sun is in the center, which Galileo is just refusing to do. It's interesting. All right, footnote 6. It's another big one. Oh no, not that big. In addition to organizing his various lodgings, Sarpy and Sarpy's Giovanni sponsored Galileo financially, with Sarpy even organizing his payments. Fulgenzio Mecanzio, Sarpy's personal secretary, paid Galileo directly, and after Sarpy's death, permanently paid Galileo's Venetian pension, in addition to his costs of publication.
In sum, Sarpy's insight that would serve as the basis for the future existence of the Venetian system was to find a way to keep the name science, but take the discovery part out of it while making people think that it was the same thing, and by preventing discoveries from taking place through this method, the vitality and meaning of science would be destroyed from the inside. If the currents of science could be taken over and enslaved to a single model that accomplished this task, then the ability of the people to both wield the power of choosing reason rather than arbitrary will, and Congress is discovery by educating their own wills according to reason, could be defeated, and under the arbitrary rule of the empire, the source of power and purpose of the nation state with them. This insight and its
Corollaries.
It recruited a circle of inner elites in Venice, and Sarpy initiated similar operations in the north, both in the Netherlands and its close neighbor. England to prepare a new staging ground for Venice's operations. Venice was to relocate its base of operations in the north, initiating trading companies in London and Amsterdam in order to set up a global financial maritime power that could crush the new nation-state system out of existence. Venice had destroyed the culture of the Netherlands throughout the 16th century through the horror of the Spanish Inquisition and continual warfare, and by the middle of the century, Venice's usurious evil was successfully imported, making the Netherlands one of the leading financial and banking centers, with merchants all over Europe rallying at its enormous stock exchange. But then, with the initiation of Sarpy's plan to move north, Venetian trading companies themselves began dominating its economy, and by 1609, the Bank of Amsterdam was founded, which was the first stock jobbing, speculative bank of its kind, fusing usurious Venetian banking with the speculation of the stock exchange, which had become so famous in the Netherlands. By the next year, in 1610, the Netherlands had been brought under political alliance with Sarpy. The Bank of Amsterdam dictated public policy, and the Netherlands grew to the greatest financial empire of trade that ever existed up until that time. Footnote 8.
Okay, and I think there was a footnote 7, I believe, too. So number 7, his bank was modeled precisely on the first central bank in history, the Banco di Rialto of Venice, established in 1585 after the victory of the Giovanni faction in 1582. And footnote 8 is Sarpy's networks also set up shop in England in the court of James I in 1603. Sir Francis Bacon was in personal correspondence with Sarpy and became the head of the Rosicrucian pagan mystics and alchemists who set up what would become London's Royal Society, while his secretary, Thomas Hobbes, would later travel to work directly under Galileo with his financial backer, the Cavendish family, in the 1630s.
After Sarpy's death in 1623, the main promoter of the Galileo project, theologian Marin Mersenne, organized a circle of empiricists that very same year, with financial backing from Sarpy's personal ally Henry Wotton and the Cavendish family, among others. Sarpy had tutored Bacon and Galileo, while Thomas Hobbes and Mersenne extracted what they could from Galileo, with Mersenne communicating directly with Sarpy's personal secretary and financial handler of Galileo, Fulgenzio Nicanzio. It was out of this Mersenne network that a suitable empiricism congruent with Sarpy was found to create a religion for the subjects of the Netherlands and the expanding Venetian Empire, Cartesianism.
Yeah, that one's Cartesianism for René Descartes.
Cartesianism. René Descartes lived most of his life in the Netherlands and starting making it in the 1630s after getting big support from the Mersenne circle. He traveled regularly to Paris to meet with them, and they in turn to the Netherlands, with Mersenne and Hobbes guiding Descartes hand in writing his work. Descartes' philosophical meditation, like a likeness of Sarpy's philosophy, was first sent to Mersenne, and then given approval by Hobbes, Galileo's direct student. In addition to the mathematical monstrosity which was his geometry, Descartes' philosophy of the universe and the mind was even more endemic and disastrous for the intentions of the Westphalian structure. Mind dead and corrupt persons were the result. Footnote
Okay.
9.
Yep. Footnote 9 reads, a crippling apparatus which locked the mind of the student into a dead universe of description. Descartes' geometry created a definition of knowable as those things capable of being explained by algebra alone. Algebra, which is nothing but a symbolic language describing the effects of real physical actions. Sarpy's universe again, where sense-perceptible effects of actual complex physical actions are all that we can hope to know. But this time cloaked in mathematical formulas. Empiricism became ever more deadly to an unwitting mind.
The fundamental tenet of Descartes'
Just Descartes is fine, I think.
Descartes' philosophy of the universe was straight from Sarpy, that the essence of matter lies in extension or length, width, and breadth, and fills up the assumed empty space of the infinite box, which is his universe. Although it introduced its own silly attempt at plausibility, the reason the Mersenne circle gave Descartes Sarpy's doctrine of extension was to deny any physical properties of bodies, such as inertia, hardness, color, or weight, because physical properties cannot be essentially depicted with geometry. Therefore, the purpose of making extension the nature of a body was that because it can be essentially depicted with geometry, then investigations of nature can be limited to the senses. Exactly this purpose is expressed in Descartes' assertion that the only truth is raw senses and mathematical descriptions. I know of no kind of material substance other than that which can be divided, shaped, and moved in every possible way, and there is absolutely nothing to investigate about this substance except those divisions, shapes, and movements, and that nothing concerning these can be accepted as true unless it is considered a mathematical demonstration. And because all natural phenomena can thus be explained, I think that no other principles of physics should be accepted or even desired. Here, unbridled Sarpy, there are no principles of physics.
Mhm.
After Descartes' death, a study group started at Leiden in the 1650s, pushing his mathematical nature of the universe, and in 1659, the De Witt leadership of the Netherlands personally published Descartes' work for the sake of the Venetian stock system and translated Descartes' geometry, which attempted to reduce the entire universe to algebra. By the 1670s, Descartes' work was sponsored doctrine in all the universities. Footnote 10.
Okay, one sec. Okay, footnote 10. The mind of those who became educated in Descartes and related empiricists would never be able to make an original leap into the causes of any phenomena again, as the opportunity and spirit of such insight was too busy with following procedure, or simply too confused with the dearth of axiomatic rules to maintain any ability left to reason at all. That's good. All right. Any thoughts or questions, or do we move on to Venice's immortal enemy? Okay, let's just keep the ball moving. All right, Kwan, you want to go for it?
Okay. So Venice's immortal enemy, the method of Sarpy's networks in preventing discoveries, destroying the morality of human culture, and creating a decades-long war, all help to spread Venice's agenda. However, from the day that Gottfried Leibniz came of age, Venice would increasingly be faced with an existential threat to their system. As the bane of Venice's existence from that day to the present, Leibniz's mind would be a constant, ironical disproof of Sarpy's insistence that human ideas and mind do not exist. Leibniz, a young theologian and lawyer who was gripped by the cultural shift of the Westphalian system, was fully inspired by the way in which Jean-Baptiste Colbert was organizing France in the 1660s, according to the economic principle that the power of man's ideas should be assimilated throughout the society to increase its standard of living and power as the greatest wealth of nations. In 1672, he traveled to Paris, hoping to advance the cause further. Years before his arrival, Leibniz had written a design for a society of sciences in Mainz and an attack on the core of Descartes' system. Do you want to read note 10 and 11 now? Or
That's a good idea, yeah. Let me do that. All right, footnote 10. The mind of those who became... Oh, wait, I read that. 11, sorry. 11. The Venice orchestrated hell of the 30 Years' War, destroying Germany and much of the rest of Europe, was ended by the statecraft of Cardinal Mazarin in organizing the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia. The principle of the sovereign nation state was reaffirmed, and nations were to be respected as states that govern their own affairs, with the development of each as the basis for the growth and the development of each other. Although immediate operations against the nations were run, a semi-stable peace and strengthening of the Renaissance conception of the nation-state was achieved. In the 1660s, the great nation-builder, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, became a power behind the throne of Louis XIV of France, and began acting according to the Treaty of Westphalia through major strides in physical economic development. Colbert's school of economy was thereby intrinsically beyond the control of the popular empiricist promotions of science for the sake of abstraction, found in the fake science of Descartes and Galileo.
Okay, continuing.
Mm-hmm.
With a resolve toward defeating the more deeply rooted enemy of empiricism, Leibniz joined Colbert's technology school for the next years, where he became associated with the great experimental scientist and Da Vinci follower Christian Huygens. Sorry. Thanks. For Leibniz, it wasn't a piecemeal approach. By the time he was studying in Paris, the comprehension of the real universe as incompatible with the anti-empiricist model occurred as in a realization in a single moment. This he did not through adapting to opinion, but in examining his own mind and genius, and allowing the powers of his mind to operate outside of the Euclidean Cartesian models that were being pushed. Upon leaving Paris, Leibniz planned both a continuation of the conveyor school outside of France and directed his powers of invention to outflank Venice as their own game. The mind's universe, following Nicolas de Cusa's concept of human reason as a level above the simple rationality of geometry that mankind could grasp, generating principles or transcendentals, such as the quality of circular action over simple extension. Leibniz went beyond the extension-based algebraic methods which Descartes had imposed. Particularly in the case of physical curves, such as the hanging chain and the isochronic curves, Leibniz discovered a method by which the mind could discover the unseen physical relation that they maintain and guiding the change along every smallest moment of the curve. Rather than imposing an extension box or upon a physical process, the physical characteristics themselves guided the investigation. Leibniz looked only at those geometrical and physical functions of physical or geometrical curves, which were direct effects of the action or unfolding of the curves, and was able, therefore, to make geometrical measurements of the curve reflect that intrinsic structure. Those functions were then the means to discover the characteristic of change, the differential principle governing the geometrical and physical curves at every moment. Then the now conceptualized sense perceptible curve existing as home in the mind. In other words, the integral was then understood as a reflection of that differential at every moment. Leibniz thereby showed, like Kepler, that it is what lies within the experimental paradoxes of what is under to the senses that can lead to increasing man's knowledge and power, and not the senses themselves. The infinitesimal calculus is what the mind conceives as true, not the senses. So you read notes 12 and 13?
Sure, yeah. And for anybody just listening to the audio, there's an image here of a hanging chain, which curves according to gravity's forces, as well as tension, horizontal tensions, in a way that looks very similar to a parabola, which is what Galileo said this was, and Leibniz and Huygens said, no, this is not exactly a parabola. This is another species of curvature, which simple naive geometry cannot account for. And it's by investigating this phenomenon that's being shaped by physical forces of gravity and horizontal tensions that are changing at every moment, right? The ratios are always changing. They're never the same. And it's by investigating that Michael Kirsch is making the point Leibniz discovered the infinitesimal calculus, the language of constant, infinitely changing processes. So anyway, it's not a mathematical idea like many are taught in school. So footnote 12, right? 12 and 13? Okay, 12
Yes.
is for Descartes. On the contrary, all things were described as being some combination of x and y values without regard to their physical nature. If that didn't work, Descartes deemed them unknowable. And then number 13 is, this is a simplified description, as each physical curve has its own particular challenge of conceiving the integral from the differential, which are in no way direct, but require investigating the principled relationships contained in the differential.
Okay, continuing. He made this point even more explicit and powerful, however, by turning this process into a new scientific language, which actually expresses and describes these unseen principles, and was the first to make this power of man into a language that could be universally communicated and applied to all physical processes.
Okay, it's a footnote 14. A
Yeah.
fuller demonstration of Leibniz's method of describing and expressing unseen principles is beyond the scope of this report, but can easily be found by this author in a December 8th issue of Dunamis, The Calling of Elliptical Functions. That link no longer works. I'll have to make a point to make that available in the description box.
At the same time, in the course of ridiculing the absurdity of Descartes' arguments, or rather, he said, simply pronouncements based on authority rather than arguments, Leibniz began the first comprehensive study of forces which are unseen but measurable in their effects, culminating in the 1690s with a complete Keplerian manual for modern science, Leibniz Dynamics, a science of causes. Through his demonstration and reasoning, Leibniz pointed out that the common crass concept of material substance is imperfect, indeed false. This concept is borrowed exclusively from the testimony of sensory imagination. Leibniz showed that since they are invisible principles which must organize matter, then the matter which is intimately related to those principles takes on an active nature, just as those principles are active, in the same way that physical curves were actively unfolded by infinitesimal principles in his calculus. And thus, his monadology, that monads are not sense perceptible unities or infinitely hard inelastic particles, but philosophical unities, the principles that organize matter. Generalizing this principle for science as a whole, dynamics is the unseen, the bounding causes which guide the actions of non-living, living, and cognitive matter, and how these causes bound the action of the composite they create, and further, how the causes themselves act to create change. Okay, so we have many notes here.
Yes, we do. We have 4 footnotes.
Yeah.
Okay, so footnote 15 says Leibniz understood that it was necessary to measure what would later be known as field by the circles of Carl Gauss, not sense perceptible, but definitely measurable. Leibniz's active matter was vindicated by the Gauss-Weber studies of electromagnetic potential, where matter is always inseparably connected with field. The future science of potential by Gauss was essentially a revival and vindication of Leibniz's metaphysics and dynamics. Based on this axiom, Leibniz's laws of motion were actually able to explain motions of collisions, unlike Descartes' laws, which limited the cause of motion to their geometrical collisions themselves. Um,
1780.
Yeah, 16 now is inelastic particles, which is a reference to the monads. Inelastic particles, otherwise known as Epicurean atoms, whose possibility he had demonstrated to be in contradiction with reason through his law of continuity and other methods, such as his refutation of Descartes' model of matter as intrinsically at rest. Yeah, a lot of people think of the monad as being these infinitely tiny particles, kind of like what he just described there, which is not how Leibniz thought of them at all. Number 17, Leibniz was also taking such ancient Greek standpoints for his dynamics as the paradox of the instant in Plato's Parmenides. Plato axiomatically forced the relation between principle and change when dealing with what appeared paradoxical from the standpoint of Parmenides' method of mere descriptions of a state of motion or a state of rest, pointing to something which must guide the change from rest to motion, which was responsible for the paradox of the instant. Finally, number 18, embedded in the methodology of Leibniz's dynamics and infinitesimal method of physical curves is that distinct physical processes define themselves as separate, distinct principles, just as Cusa had demonstrated, as opposed to the homogeneous, infinitely extended box of Sarpy. The concept of space, time, and motion were for Leibniz, and for all great scientists later, such as Gauss's school, Riemann and his followers Einstein and Vernadsky. I think we should add Planck to that mix too. Particularly expressions of the principles which were organizing the particular physical processes under investigation. Characteristic properties are investigated in order to come to an unseen organizing principle, and it is the force of this principle which defines a particular state of existence, which is called space, time, or motion. Actions themselves define the universe from the inside, and it is the goal of the human mind to be able to live inside that universe by using assumptions and discoveries as merely stepping stones to ascend to a clearer understanding of what governs a particular phenomenon or area under investigation. Practically speaking, of such stepping stones, there are an array of principles governing and interacting with the principle of life, currently under investigation, coming from galactic and supergalactic phenomenon, such as cosmic radiation, which are active principles and necessary to unveil the way in which mankind must increase his mastery over his present solar system and beyond.
Okay. An explosion of articles and discoveries erupted from the pages of the Leibniz Acta Eruditorum throughout the end of the 1680s, and by the middle of the 1690s had completely revolutionized all of geometry, mathematics, and physics. To emphasize the point, through Leibniz's infinitesimal calculus, unseen principles of physical actions were now actually made definitively expressible, and thus Sarpy's precious Venetian deployment to hijack science overturned. Thus, Leibniz's discoveries, made for their own sake and the glory of man's role and power in the universe, were also intended as a direct attack on Sarpy's empiricism, Venice's main principle of natural warfare. Through Leibniz's revival of a true metaphysics according to these sciences, like Kepler, he defined the notion of a true scientist who, understanding the mind he's using, dwells within the domain of creativity, which itself he realizes must be congruent with the creative process by which the universe itself is constantly being created. Therefore, rather than the nature of the human mind reflecting a universe that consisted of extension, the universe instead reflected a human mind of a nature which consists in the capacity as an agent for the continuing creation of the universe.
It's a big statement. And we have here at the very end a little diagram from Kepler's Harmonies of the World of his model for the solar system using musical scales. Each planet having its own bandwidth of notes, stretching from the same note going off to a half like Venus, to Mercury, which has the greatest spectrum of notes from its aphelion to perihelion distances and speeds from the sun. So we're moving on now to the dynamics of the nation state. Let me just quickly scroll. I'm just curious to see. I really don't know how far we are. Okay.
Not very far.
This is the end of it here.
Yeah.
And dynamics of the nation state are, oh, not as far as I expected. Okay, not very far. We should keep reading.
No.
Okay. Jerry, do you want to read?
Yes, okay. The dynamic of the nation state. Leibniz's science of reason and causes was the guiding hand in building a republican movement that could defend the rights of man according to the Westphalian intention, capable of cutting through the empiricist sophistry that had gripped Europe as a whole. In the years after his return from France in 1676, Leibniz organized more broadly for the creation of academies of science in each European capital, working in close contact with one another, supported by rulers who likewise sought to promote the common good and general welfare of mankind. In contrast to most of the academies in Europe, which, having abandoned Da Vinci's inseparability between scientific experiment and improving man's condition, were thus devoted only to the satisfaction of curiosity. Leibniz's academies were designed to channel the development of the arts and sciences for the benefit of the countries and their inhabitants through the promotion of manufacturing, industry, and commerce. This would be done, as he said, in order that, quote, the Republic of Scientists were no longer a mere phrase, but became a well-organized and prosperous great power, a federation of learned societies doing their best to civilize mankind through the expansion of sciences, unquote. Guided by the principle that the purpose of science was to apply discoveries to increase man's power over nature, he wrote, quote, sciences and arts are the only genuine wealth of people, which distinguishes them from animals and discriminates between civilized nations and barbarians, unquote. As the promotion of society is the only basis for a standard of value, real scientific economy is based on this intrinsic value of creativity, in contrast to Venetian monetarism. Just as Leibniz's own scientific discoveries were made in accordance with demonstrating the nature of a universe which placed man's reason as the guiding hand above all, Leibniz's creation of the academies of science were proscribed, guided, and later established from this highest standpoint of bringing mankind out of its infancy and freeing it from the monetarism and usury of Venice, defeating Venice's renewed Sarpy empiricism, which promoted science but outlawed discovery, and thereby relegated all economy to monetarism. While Leibniz's entire intent was moving in this direction, Venice was moving to spread its monetary empire to colonize England as a new base for their bestial operation to bring an end to the Westphalian era and civilization itself. England, which incidentally served to define that very question for the future of Europe and America. This brings us now to the heart of our tale. 1. The battlefield of England. As the decade of the 1690s came to a close, with England's lifeblood being sucked dry, Leibniz reflected on the growing torrent of cultural decay of Sarpy's spawned empiricism. Quote, I even find that somewhat similar opinions, stealing gradually into the minds of men of high station who rule the rest and on whom affairs depend, and by slithering into fashionable books, are inclining towards the universal revolution with which Europe is threatened, and completing the destruction of what still remains in the world of the generous sentiments of the ancient Greeks and Romans, who placed love of country and of the public good and the welfare of future generations before fortune and even before life. This public spirit, as the English call it, is dwindling away and is no longer in fashion. It will die away all the more when it ceases being sustained by the good morality and true religion which natural reason itself teaches us. They sneer openly at love of country, and they ridicule those who are concerned for the public good. And when some well-meaning man speaks of the prospects of posterity, they say, let the future look after itself. Unquote. Although officially occupied by agents for Venetian empiricism and empire since the reign of James I, such as Hobbes and Bacon, the Venetians didn't officially move to take over England until 1688. Fed up with the Stuarts' resistance to setting up a central bank like Amsterdam, and their refusal to being used against France for war, Venetian agents had been conspiring to overthrow the king since the 1670s, led by Ashley Cooper, founder of the Whig Party, who incidentally had been in exile since 1681 for this very reason. Then, in 1688, England was fully invaded by 20,000 men and 500 ships. A junto of mostly Whig aristocrats who allied with the Netherlands invasion by the House of Orange became the leadership of the government, many around the circle of Cooper, some traders in England, other go-betweens like Netherlands ambassador John Churchill. The plan was to indebt and loot England, use it for war speculation, and eventually turn England into Venice.
Just an interesting note that I came across in my current research, because I'm going to be putting together this thing I mentioned on the roots of AI, and I mentioned cybernetics, which is being funded by the Macy Foundation. The Macy Foundation was founded and headed by a guy named Marlborough Churchill, General Marlborough Churchill, who was a cousin of Winston Churchill. And John Churchill, this character, is the Duke of Marlborough. So he was named after John Churchill. So it's the same operation in the 20th century, which is working to destroy Leibniz or co-opt Leibniz for their own uses by extracting what Leibniz was actually thinking and saying, by the same family. It's very interesting.
Yes. And you can read footnote 19.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Okay, footnote 19. English Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, grandson of a Venetian merchant, wrote as much in 1844. Quote, "The great obstacle of the Whig leaders in England in 1688 was to establish in England a high aristocratic republic on the model of the Venetian. William III told the Whig leaders, 'I will not be a doge.' The reign of Anne was a struggle between the Venetian and the English systems. George I was a doge. George II was a doge. George III tried not to be a doge, but he could not rid himself of the Venetian constitution." Great quote.
Okay, continuing. Patriots of nations don't submit to a foreign empire so quickly, however. And despite the long corruption of England since the Venetian companies moved in under James I in 1603, the culture itself still had a kernel of sovereign impulse, led by patriots and collaborators of Leibniz, such as Robert Harley and Daniel Defoe. In 1691, they issued a plan to fight the speculative war debt being created by the imported Dutch finance through a national land bank for development and regulation of interest rates to be in accord with the necessity of the physical economy. This was a job for John Locke, the Junto's main propagandist, having come over in Queen Mary's baggage in 1688, after living in exile with his sponsor, Cooper. After attempting to justify the Venetian coup with his treatises on government the previous year, he met Harley's rational plan with his own sophistry, rehashing some economic arguments of the Venetian allied Salamancan school, which he had plagiarized, such as Martin de Azpilicueta Navarro. Locke effectively said, quote, "Your plan would upset the bestial society which the Venetians had run the whole operation of bringing Orange in the first place, and that would really cramp the style of their attempt to load debt and destruction upon Europe," unquote. Thus lying and saying anything necessary to get his point across, Locke attacked any government direction of the economy, control over currency, or any limit on interest rate to prevent speculation, arguing that the market sets its own value. Things must be left to find their own price, as the natural interest is set by an unknowable force. Money is money, Locke said, and can never be brought under control just because I said so, and you are too confused by my sophistry to disagree. After such disorientation was spread, Charles Montague, treasurer, key leader of the Venetian Junto, and part of the welcoming committee of the foreign invaders, established the Bank of England in 1694 through an act of Parliament, which was founded by William Patterson, an imported student of the Bank of Amsterdam. Montague then organized large loans through the private bank, controlled not by the king, but Parliament, and while supposedly helping the war-torn economy, created a giant monetary debt out of thin air, a quantity for speculation and impoverishment of England, proceeding to push through dictatorial financial decisions for the economy, while never once issuing anything for development. For the job, Montague selected the alchemist and calculating machine Isaac Newton, appointing him Warden of the Mint to carry out the enormous data processing job involved in the lying and faking on behalf of the numerous transitions in the economy for the sake of the empire, such as a gruesome recoinage which cut the people's wealth in half. Footnote 20.
Mm-hmm. Footnote 20, Newton immediately proffered his niece for sexual favors to Montague in payment for the appointment. And for extra credit, as warden of the mint, Newton personally advocated the death penalty and torture for petty thieves of coin wherever possible. Sociopath. Really sick guy.
In the face of all of this, some of the English patriots continued to fight, as parliamentarian Robert Price rallied. Quote, "How can we hope for happy days in England when this great lord and other foreigners are in the English and also in the Dutch councils? I foresee that when we are reduced to extreme poverty, as now we are very near it, we are to be supplanted by our neighbors and become a colony of the Dutch." Unquote. By 1697, a deliberately forced depression and credit crunch left England weakened and subdued for the Junto to then give the bank a monopoly over all banking and the appointment of Montague as Prime Minister. The financial takeover by Venice was complete, and the Parliament ruled the bank as the de facto government, as all policy making was absorbed into it. Montague took a trip to Venice the next year to report on the success of the operation. The nation of England, thrown into war and looted, was being successfully colonized, just as the Netherlands had before.
And that's a little drawing of the signing of the Bank of England's charter. Eureka, you want to take it up?
Leibniz blank.
Sorry, Eureka?
Yes.
For the sake of people listening on YouTube or BitChute, could you go closer to your device to pick up your voice better?
Okay.
Thanks.
Leibniz blank. Is that better?
Yeah.
However, unlike what the Venetian empiricists would have hoped, history is guided dynamically, and the idea behind the Westphalian system acted in ways beyond their comprehension, with a struggle ensuing, having far-reach consequences. Gottfried Leibniz had begun working for the Duke of Brunswick in the House of Hanover in 1680, recruiting his wife Sophie and her daughter Sophie Charlotte to his view that only a movement of educated reason could defeat the arbitrary power of Venetian manipulated assemblies and rulers. In 1690, he had begun a history of Hanover for the Duke, gaining access to many libraries for his task. By 1692, Leibniz discovered a flank against Venice. Leibniz demonstrated that Hanover, in which the House of Brunswick resided, was in fact next in line for the English succession following Anne, daughter of James II. After organizing for his claim, his finding was made official in 1696, and by 1701, Robert Harley succeeded in getting the Parliament to pass the Act of Settlement, guaranteeing this Hanoverian succession. To the European theater in the war against Venice's takeover, when Queen Anne took the throne in 1702, this meant that Gottfried Leibniz, the renowned leader against empiricism and advocate and warrior of the Westphalian system, could be personally advising the head of state of England at any time.
We have a portrait of Queen Anne.
On the opposing side, when Anne came to power, the Venetian Junto moved in to make her its tool, as William of Orange had been, and relations with Hanover, where Leibniz was advising now Electress Sophie, were tightly controlled. Things came to a head in 1705 when Leibniz and his circles conspired for a visit to Sophie to London in order to directly influence Anne against the Junto. Montague's network blocked the action by means of an open letter circulated to embarrass Queen Anne and smear Leibniz's name. And subsequently, Montague personally visited Hanover, attempting to secure the crown for the Junto over Leibniz in the case of Anne's death.
All right, so we have a footnote 21, which is her husband, the Duke of Brunswick, had died in 1696, putting her next in line. I see.
Other, more covert opportunities would have to be taken, and Leibniz's allies around the court began secretly educating Anne in the principles of the nation state, including Republican intelligence operative extraordinaire and Leibniz's main ally in the Isles, Jonathan Swift. Secretary of State Harley was on the verge of achieving peace with France in 1706 when the Junto struck back, demanding Harley be booted out and replaced by one of their own. Anne resisted, and her intention began manifesting itself against them, leading to a breakthrough when Swift personally came to England in 1708, and Anne began moving openly against Venice's interests in favor of England, even seeking to replace her Venetian Junto prime minister. The Swift-Leibniz faction was threatening takeover. The Junto, in a panic, pulled out all the stops. Montague flagged his asset at the Mint. Now President of Royal Society, Newton, and a proposal for a public defamation campaign against Leibniz was written out. John Churchill, head of the army in the ongoing war with France, and who had had the most control over the Queen, personally blackmailed her by threatening resignation unless Harley was dismissed. The Queen submitted, Harley resigned, and the Venetian Junto subsequently filled every post in the cabinet. Having won the battle, the penned accusation of plagiarism against Leibniz was shelved for the time.
Okay, that's footnote 22 is this was an accusation that Leibniz had not discovered the principle of the infinitesimal calculus, but had taken it from Newton.
But the Junto had overplayed its hand, and Anne was simply waiting for an opportunity to bring the swift Leibniz circles in to save her nation, who in turn used ironic wit and the enemy's own mistake against them. When Swift returned to England in August 1710, the Junto ministry was cleaned out by the end of the month. Under these new circumstances, the idea of Leibniz coming to London with Sophie was an ever-present threat in the minds of the Venetians and the Dutch invaders.
For anybody who wants this story in greater detail than you could possibly imagine, I recommend Googling How the Nation Was Won by Graham Lowry, which you can get on archive.org for free. So How the Nation Was Won by Graham Lowry, archive.org, and it goes through this entire story in a remarkable detail. Sorry, yeah, you can go on, Eureka.
Montague's precious rent. Realizing their defeat, the Venetian Junto raged and took every other route they could to discredit Leibniz, whose influence they could feel but not understand. Only 2 months after being ejected from the ministry, it initiated its latent attack on Leibniz. Montague, steered from Venice, advised his asset at the Royal Society, Isaac Newton, that for the role he was to play in the subsequent period, it would be wise to move the society to a location that would be more supportive of the new agenda, to London's financial district. In November, the Royal Society, which had always been located at Gresham College, was moved to Crane Court by diktat, against the desires of the majority of the Academy by Newton in 1710. With this done, the charge of plagiarism, penned in 1708, was now issued in the public forum of the Royal Society proceedings from the new Royal Society in the financial district of London. Meanwhile, with Harley as Prime Minister, England gained a respite from willful looting and destruction of the economy, and his original 1691 plan for a national land bank was pushed through and started to make the means for economic development available for the country, and began to alleviate the debt which had been created. Despite attempts to stall increases of available money through the use of Tool Newton at the Mint, Harley's government corporation served as a driver for development. Leibniz endorsed his plan, communicating to the Harley cabinet, "Your new ministry disabused those foreigners who had doubted if it would contribute, as it has, to the general situation. For one can say that it surpasses its predecessor, not only in paying the costs of the present, but also in making good those of the past and satisfying the debts of the nation." In this new context, Leibniz devised a second attempt to bring Sophie and himself to London to strengthen the validity and resolve of Harley's ministry. In desperation, Montague had his asset Newton at the Royal Society issue a rant in April 1712 about anything but the infinitesimal calculus, declaring himself as originator and demanding Leibniz to never have existed. This rant was subsequently praised by the financiers and bank parasites in the court, and in the wake of the fraud, they used this official ruling of plagiarism to their effect. wielding it as a leverage to move against Leibniz directly. Thus, when the new visit for Sophie to London was officially made in September of that year, it was blocked this time despite the dominant Harley ministry. The anti-Leibniz faction in Anne's cabinet began to attack him from within and personally encourage Anne to prevent the visit. In addition, Montague himself had appeared at Hanover, counseling Venice's Hanoverian asset Georg Ludwig against Sophie making the trip. Georg subsequently moved to cut Leibniz's salary in Hanover. In the aftermath of this, Leibniz wrote the next month to an ally in the Ministry of the Difficulty, "You will have received my letter where I spoke to you of the plot that I learned of to attack me in your country." When Sophie died in 1714 of natural causes, Anne was no longer seen as a necessity to block Leibniz's control of England under Sophie, and she herself died within weeks of Sophie with similar symptoms to those of the wife, son, grandson, and nephew of Louis the
That's the 14th.
14th? Okay.
Yeah.
Who were all lethally poisoned in 1712. The newly crowned Venetian asset King George immediately rejected the peace plan with France accomplished by Harley and Anne, and made Charles Montague his prime minister. Venice, whom he had served, was pleased. Leibniz wrote to his ally in Hanover, Caroline of Anbach, Princess of Wales, that it was not Sophie, but England that was lost by her death. The threat of Leibniz coming to power in England and coordinating a broader alliance of nation states dynamically influenced all of the actions of the oligarchy in England from 1702 to 1714. With this threat removed under Junto asset King George in 1714, there was no obstacle in the Venetian empire of monetarism could not then overcome. England was now destined to be the seat of the British New World monetary empire by the close of 2 generations later.
Okay, I think that would be probably an appropriate place to end tonight's reading, because we have here now a new section in this paper opening up. Let me just scroll. This might actually be 3 readings. I didn't, yeah, it's looking that way. Okay, so let's do that. Let's round it out for tonight. With that little burst of history. That's a lot of material condensed efficiently, eh? By the way, everyone's on mute.
Yes, it's an amazing history of that, especially of England, the takeover of England. I've never really, read about that before.
Well, you've read Graham Lowry's book, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you did have that in your mind.
Yeah, but this goes into it in more detail.
Yes, it does. It's true. Yeah.
Well, the French intellectual Jacques Attali, who was an advisor to President François Mitterrand for many years, wrote the same story, but from the standpoint of Venice.
Oh yeah, really?
Yes, yes. And the title of the book is Les Juifs, le monde et l'argent, or Les Juifs, l'argent et le monde. I don't remember the order,
Okay.
but those are the 3 elements of the story. And if you read that story, of course, you have the the history of the Jewish nation, but the core of his book is truly this story, but from the standpoint of Venice.
Oh, that's interesting. I got to find that.
Oh, it's easy to find. It has been published 15 years ago, I think. I still have the copy here, and I bought it in a pocketbook, and it's a thick pocketbook. It's
Hmm.
maybe 600 pages.
Wow.
I think you would be amused to read it.
I will. I will be amused to read it. Yeah, the entire intersection of the clash of economic paradigms is as well as scientific paradigms. It's just so to like I many people know about the Bank of England, the creation of the Bank of England and the Dutch takeover in 1688, which sort of set a new system of empire into motion in Britain. But many people just think, and that was it. That's when Britain really went for total empire with no resistance. But then to see that there was this humanist school fighting on the highest levels to create a national land bank under Harley's program that had the support of Leibniz, and that Newton was working for the Bank of England while Leibniz was supporting this physical economy approach in opposition, right? It is an anti-usury form of banking, and that both networks are just so on the front lines fighting each other. It's just so incredible. Ultimately, the land bank didn't work out. I think it got turned into a speculative venture that got enmeshed with the South Sea Company that became the bubble, the big South Sea bubble that burst in 1720 and just wiped out all of Isaac Newton's savings because Newton was a big speculator. Obviously, he believed in a universe of rolling gambling dice.
I think also it shows that people like Leibniz and Jonathan Swift and even Newton weren't just sitting back writing some philosophical books. They were in the middle of this war, this raging war, total political war.
Mm-hmm.
It gives a sense of that.
Yeah.
Also, they saw this takeover of England as the key fight, too, that they were fighting against the Venetians.
Mm-hmm.
They recognized that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so much healthier, right? To take people out of their ivory tower the way we're taught to think about philosophers is just these ideas floating in the clouds that are interesting, and actually tie a personality with an identity in history into that formula. It gives it so much more soul, and it's so much more useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that what they were writing was part of the fight.
What's that, Quan?
No, it's always the question of the context. Okay, if I go back to the book by Attali that would tell the same story but from the standpoint of Venice, I would say that you have the historical context, and you also need to have a bigger perspective. Okay, because imagine someone who read the book of Attali, and it's a very well written book with plenty of technical and historical details. But if you don't have a bigger perspective, you would be brainwashed completely.
What do you walk away with? What is somebody going to walk away with after reading his book? What will be the more dangerous assumptions that they would be brainwashed with?
Well, the most dangerous assumption is the following, because it looks like a philanthropic action. Okay, the idea that Attali put to the forefront is that money was the tool, the instrument uh, which decrease violence between human beings. Okay, so if you have your nation subjugated or forced to pay a, a debt over many generations, it's preferable than to be massacred in a war, for example. Okay, so you would finish that book with the impression that the central bankers are the saviors of mankind, more or less, because they were the instrument of providence to bring mankind to a lesser degree of violence. It's still violent, but it's less violent.
Oh, that's interesting that you can get that history and devious, very devious.
No, absolutely brilliant, like Sarpy. Okay.
Yeah.
And once again, we always have the same thing that recur. I think during our readings is that what is proposed to prevent mankind to evolve to the ultimate, if you want, it's not something false. Is that something lower, something more limited?
Mm-hmm.
Because once again, what Sarpy was proposing is what Plato in his epistemology called eikasia, the shadows. Okay, and which in the realm of politics correspond to the Democrats. Okay, not in the sublime sense of democracy, but in the sense of Plato, which is just above the mob rule.
Yeah, the a politics based entirely on the art of persuasion and pastry cooking of language.
Oh.
Oh,
is everyone frozen, or it's just you, man?
I don't know,
you were
Jerry.
frozen for 10 seconds.
I thought the same about you, okay. Jerry. Was I frozen, or was Quan frozen, or both of us?
Neither one. I heard you both.
Eureka, you agree with Jerry?
Yes, I heard you both.
So Eureka and Jerry are in a healthier space-time, Quan, than you or me. We're trapped in a in a weird static.
There's something weird happening. Yeah. You never know. We are speaking of a dangerous book.
Yeah. Of course. Well, just on that note, there is another historian who's useful in this sense, probably less sophisticated than Attali, who's Niall Ferguson, who he's a highly placed British ideologue in Harvard who, when you read, I haven't read the entirety of his book, Empire, on the history of empire, but he goes through rigorously the first sort of international merger of the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company that merged to form this behemoth. And he goes through this interesting history of the empire in a way that most people don't tackle it. And also the creation of central banking, their role in the empire. And it's all he's looking at all the right things. But then by the end, it's sort of the same sort of conclusion where you end up sympathizing or empathizing with these financiers and imperialists.
Wow, that's what I call mythology and narrative, mythology and conversation, MC.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the creation of mythology. And once again, I think that we all people who read very much, and I would say, well, artificially, okay? If I have to choose to be someone who read very much like me, I would choose to be me, of course. But if I have to choose to be someone who doesn't read at all, or who would be in the trap of that kind of mythology, I would prefer to be someone who doesn't read at all, rather than to be poisoned by those things if you don't have, let's say, enough reading experiences to have a bigger perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I've had this question thrown at me from a few people over the last several months, which basically amounts to, do you have any tricks or techniques for reading fast? And the point I often try to get across is, try to read slow, because when you're reading slow, you're thinking, especially if you're not used to reading a lot, you know, like, so a lot of people, they just want to, like, they think it's the amount of content you're processing. And somebody like you, Quan, you've honed your craft of thinking quite highly, so you can process, I know, quite a bit, and you've got a very active mind. But I think a lot of people, it's if you take the time to spend, like, really dwell and think and take notes as you're reading something challenging, that will have much more payoff in the long run qualitatively than if you were to read 5 or 6 books and not retain or generate your own active thoughts, because you're just like receiving information and you're not generating actively within you any new thoughts. So it doesn't even stay with you after you finish reading the book and somebody asks you to describe it. You can't even do that.
Exact, and it's very interesting what you just said, because if I don't know if you remember, in some of the Hollywoodian productions, they often show a often in their dystopian things, they would often show a guy with a machine on the head, and the machine would feed him with all kind of information,
Yeah.
but the guy is looking stupid or completely inactive, and it's part of that mythology and propaganda
Yeah.
of cybernetics, precisely. Okay, I don't want you to remember one episode of Star Trek, the first Star Trek with James T. Kirk. Okay, one of the episodes is showing a machine that would transform you into a neurosurgeon after 10 seconds, and there's a kind of giant helmet that would cover your brain, and you would see all kind of light, and after that you become completely brilliant for 2 hours, the time to perform the neurosurgical operation. Uh, uh, I realized that all the popular culture, maybe of the last 30 years, maybe unconsciously, was the vehicle for that kind of mythology, conversation, and propaganda.
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely Elon Musk's Neuralink
Yeah,
project, which
yeah,
Bezos and Zuckerberg are also heavily invested into. That's basically the idea, right? Implanting these brain chips to create another layer that allows us to interface directly with the internet. So the idea would be, if, you know, instead of having to wait to Google something, you could just think it and know it immediately. uh,
yeah,
yeah,
exact.
that's how they sell
And
it.
that's exactly the utter opposite of reading Plato and discussing Plato and trying to understand the principle, the perspective, the ideas,
Mm-hmm.
and not having your brain completely downloaded with things that would be not necessarily useful.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I'm grateful for Google and all those things. Okay, it's one of my phantasm becoming true. But I would say that I'm happy to be in between. Okay, because I'm of the generation that learned to read with books. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
internet became serious when I was 30 years old. So I was grateful for that machine, but my mind was not formed by that machine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very good point. Yeah, I wonder sometimes. I'm very concerned about the younger generation who are like under 23, 25, 24, 23, and younger especially, who just don't know anything but having been processed in that matrix. It's shaky. And it's
No, it's
yeah.
shaky.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. Because well, it's very clear in Plato. Okay, the conversation between friends is a kind of externalization of the conversation of your soul with itself. Okay, uh, and there's something deeper that is in action when you read Plato. That is not in action when you read something else, or if you read. Well, I think that you're at the level that you can read Atali and not being poisoned. But I would not recommend that book to an innocent young person of 15 or 16 or 17 or 18 years old,
Mhm.
because if he's not uh, accompanied in his reading, he could be poisoned by that book.
But aren't all opinions equal, Quan? Aren't you being a bit of an elitist? Come on, who do you think you are?
Well, I am in the sense that, well, I, maybe I'm a little bit elitist, but I am a little bit, how can I say that? Uh, well, I pretend that some books can poison you if you're not prepared to read that. Okay, if you don't have a bigger perspective, or if you don't have a group of persons with uh, with at least one person having a bigger perspective. Okay, if you read Attali's book combined with this article, it would be good. Okay, or if you read the article, which is shorter than the book, okay, common sense. If you read the article and after you read the book, you would have many technical or historical details in the book that are not present in the article, but you would be capable to interpret them in the light of the article.
Mm-hmm. And that's what's so wicked about the types of reforms that were undertaken under Julian Huxley when he set up, the United Nations Education, Science, and Cultural Organization, and at the OECD under Sir Alexander King, who he was working with, which was doing the same thing. Is that they started infusing all of these modern existential books that had these insipid Trojan horse concepts into them, like whether it's Catcher in the Rye, that just is this kid going on an existential ride with no real point, or more insidiously, like Lord of the Flies, or Brave New World, or 1984. It's like, if you're not equipped to have already formed certain critical powers of judgment, then simply reading that as a 13, 14-year-old, you're permanent. The you're just taking it in. You have no ability to judge how much of it is what's false, what's true, and your soul is being forever shaped by these things.
Poi- don't be shy with
Poisoned,
words,
poisoned,
Matthew. Poison. Okay.
poisoned. Yes, thank you.
Yes, because it would shape your mind in that dystopian view of reality.
Yeah.
Okay, and when we speak of cultural optimism or cultural pessimism, those novels are shaping or poisoning people's mind in a
Mm-hmm.
cultural pessimism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And once again, it's not entirely false, because bad things happens in the history of mankind, of course. But once again, it's not that it's false, but it's of a lower nature of it's limited to
Mm-hmm.
acacia,
Mm-hmm.
to sense perception. And and it goes back to Sarpy's methodology. I think that's after all the psyops and so on nowadays they are all great grandchildren of Paolo Sarpy
Right.
to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Sarpy's spirit. He didn't believe in a spirit, and yet it's alive and well, haunting people today, generations after he died.
Yeah.
Well, you know, Alma Deutscher, the young prodigy composer and musician, she's an incredible young girl. But I think she put it really nicely in an interview when she was probably 12 years old, and she was talking about how all of these critics, musical critics, would be critical of her because she wrote music which was positive and inspired. Um, and they would say, but you're too young. You're only writing these things because you're young and naive. And you should be, as you get older, writing uglier music with more dissonances and atonality to reflect the ugliness of the world. That's the philosophy of music that's very dominant in a lot of these intellectual circles. And her response was just so pure. And she just said, you know, I know that the world is ugly. My parents watch the news and I watch the news, but why should I be a mirror of ugliness? I want the world to be better. So I want the beauty inside of me to come out and help make the world better. It's just so pure and so honest and good as an answer. But a lot of people, they just, you know, read or they watch movies or shows or whatever else, or read books that have a sort of ugly quality because, you know, the world is ugly. So it's just sort of me exploring the ugliness of the sick human psyche, or, you know, whatever. And it becomes almost like a bit of an addiction, an unhealthy one, where you
Yes.
just, you know, and you're not given a positive sense of what's a healthy human being supposed to be, what's a healthy society supposed to be. You're never exposing yourself to that. So it's just, yeah, as you say, poison.
Yeah. Predictive conditioning, I think it's
Mm.
called predictive conditioning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you're trained to think in a certain manner,
Mm.
and and it's difficult to get out of that certain manner to think.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, we all need more Leibniz.
Well, yeah, and no, but that article is incredible.
Yeah.
I think that, and once again, always. Well, I think that it's a fundamental uh, melody in our group. Okay, it's always epistemology, ethics, and politics. Okay, it's always together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's a good, healthy synthesis.
Yeah, it's always together.
Mm-hmm. So for
And
Mhm.
no, I'm finished.
well, I think for tonight, we should probably round it out, and I'll hopefully have our interview with Butch Valdez ready and uploaded by tomorrow. And Cynthia's class is taking interesting shapes. So it's going to be fun on Sunday. So if you have friends or people that you think are hungry for big ideas, feel free to extend the invitation to them. And yeah, let's meet back very soon.
Ciao.
Bye, guys.
Okay, ciao.
Ciao.